In the last chapter of the big story, we met tall Saul, the new king, and Samuel, the prophet. These are people who sometimes live on the edge of the town. Sometimes they're a bit weird. They do weird stuff sometimes as a kind of symbolic act of storytelling, exposing religion that's just religion for religion's sake and promoting goodness. But they also care passionately about God and about God's words and about God's ways and about God's glory. And so sometimes the rich, powerful, important people don't like the prophets because they're inconvenient. But always they've got their eyes fixed on God, on righteousness and justice. Now today in our country in 2021 in England, we feel like the Queen or, the next person who will be a king, they're probably fairly safe to be around. They probably spend their day opening fates, maybe dedicating new motorways or bridges, maybe posing for a new stamp. Maybe they might be a little bit annoyed if you were to be disrespectful to them, but they're not going to throw you in the dungeons. They're not going to strike your head off with a sword. They're just going to carry on doing their ceremonial duties. That's what a king or a queen does now in our culture, in our context. But way back then, in this portion of our story, it was totally different. The job of a king was to provide safety for the kingdom, and it was to provide an extension of the kingdom. It was to go into battle. It was to lead the troops into war and make sure that your kingdom was safe and that it was getting bigger, that you were taking over more towns and villages. And that is what tall Saul had been doing. He'd been winning a few wars. He'd been receiving the accolades and the affirmation of all of his loyal subjects. He'd been enjoying banquets where people would come and sit at his table and tell him how wonderful the food was and how wonderful he was. And pride begins to creep in. Because it probably would for all of us. Why wouldn't it? If you're winning at everything and all of a sudden everybody thinks you're brilliant, you suddenly start to believe your own press. And so Saul had this battle with pride, and whilst he was winning other battles, he wasn't winning this one. In fact, he takes the place of God in his own eyes. He starts to think that he can do whatever he wants, that he's beyond reproach, that he can take gold that isn't due to him, that he can assume positions within society which aren't really his, and that nobody will ever dare say that he's wrong. And he's almost right. Apart from, of course, Samuel, because Samuel's a prophet, and prophets don't care about annoying the kings because they follow the words of the king. And God tells Samuel to go to Saul and say, "You're done. Time's up. You have not been representing God as you should have been to your people. In fact, now you're just representing yourself. And so, says Samuel, I'm going to anoint a new king." Which, as I'm sure you can imagine, didn't go down all that well with Saul. Meanwhile, while all that's been going on, there's this guy called David who's been causing a little bit of a stir. He's a shepherd, which is good because shepherds have been quite good leaders of God's people up until now. He's also a poet and a thinker and a writer and a creative and a singer and a musician, which is good because creating things and art, well, that's also been good in the story of God so far. It turns out he's also met tall Saul. There was this time when David went to visit his brothers. His brothers are in the army. David's not old enough to be in the army yet, and his brothers are in the army, except they're not having a fight. They're just camped out on one side of a valley looking at the army of the Philistines on the other side of the valley. And there's this big guy in the middle because the Philistines, they've decided that they're going to change the rules. They're not going to have all the armies fighting because that just leads to a whole load of angst. Let's just send out one person, one-on-one, mano a mano, and whoever wins that one, that army wins. Well, of course that's what they decided because they've got a massive giant, this guy called Goliath. Nobody's ever defeated him. He's like a gladiator who's eaten sugar. The guy is massive. And so all of David's brothers and the whole of the rest of the army are just camped out, all with their knees knocking, all thinking they're never going to win this. David turns up one day to give them some food. Because, now if you're in the army, they'll give you a uniform and food and stuff. But back then they didn't. You had to provide your own. So David turns up one day to give them some food and asks, what's going on? Why is nobody taking on this guy? Everybody says, well, it's because he's too big. David says, well, we're God's people. I'll give it a whirl. Saul, tall Saul, the king, says to him, well, if you're going to do it, thanks very much, but you're going to need a sword and a helmet and a breastplate. You're going to need a whole load of armor. Why don't you take mine? Why don't you pretend to be a king? David knows he doesn't need to pretend to be anybody. In fact, all he needs to do is to rely on God. And so he says to Saul, nah, you're good. He picks up his slingshot, which he uses as a shepherd, and he picks up some stones, and he marches into battle with just some prayer, some stones, and a slingshot. You can guess how that goes for the giant. So now Samuel has anointed this new king, David, and he's living in this in-between moment where Samuel knows and David knows, and quite frankly so do a lot of other people, that David is going to be the next king. David is the one they're looking forward to kind of right the wrongs that Saul has started to introduce into the culture. Nobody likes what Saul's doing and who he's become as king, and so they're already starting to look towards David and to appreciate how brilliant he is. So now we have this chase scene, which lasts for quite a while. It lasts for a few years. And David is chased throughout the kingdom by Saul and his armies. Saul thinks if he can kill David, then he'll stop David taking over the kingdom and he'll be able to remain king forever. So his plan is catch David, kill him. Simple. Saul chases him with his army, including, just for an EastEnders plot twist, his son, Jonathan, who happens to be one of David's best friends. And so there's this chase that happens across mountains and hills and through caves. There's moments where they nearly catch him, where David literally sneaks behind trees and rocks and manages to evade capture. And all the while this is going on, David, pursued by his enemies, wondering why God isn't helping him, wondering where God is in saving him, literally rescuing him from this army, wondering why people, the king, is slandering him and saying bad things about him, why things aren't going right, even though he's trying to do the good thing and follow the ways of God. David writes all these things down. All this faith, all this fear, all this frustration, all this anger, all this bitterness, all this feeling of, God, why don't you just kill Saul? That would make my life a whole lot easier. He writes these poems and songs down because, remember, he's a creative. And we still have them. They're right in the centre of the Bible. They're called the Psalms. And many of them are honest portrayals of David, sometimes literally fearing for his life, hiding in the back of a cave, pouring out everything he's got in here to God. That's why those Psalms are so brilliant to turn to sometimes, because if you haven't got the words to express your own anger or frustration and things aren't going right in your life, you can use the words that David wrote. And so in time, King Saul, tall Saul, dies and David takes over as king. He marches into Jerusalem. He turns it into a great capital city. He unites all the 12 tribes of Israel. He creates peace in the land and he wins more battles, extending the kingdom even further. This, it feels like, surely is the promised land, finally, that the Hebrew people, that the people of God had so longed for ever since escape from Egypt. Things are going great. By the way, David comes from Bethlehem. Wonder if that place will ever get another mention.